Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Marks of the Craft from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Marks of the Craft. In former times, operative masons, the Steinmetzen or stonecutters of Germany, were accustomed to place some mark or sign of their own invention, which, like the monogram of the painters, would seem to identify the work of each. They are to be found upon the cathedrals, churches, castles, and other stately buildings erected since the 12th century, or a little earlier in Germany, France, England, and Scotland. As Professor George Godwin has observed in his History and Ruins, it is curious to see that these marks are of the same character, in form, in all these different countries. They were principally crosses, triangles, and other mathematical figures, and many of them were religious symbols. Specimens taken from different buildings supply such forms as are here illustrated. The last of these is the well-known Vesica Pisces, the symbol of Christ among the primitive Christians, and the last but one is the Pythagorean pentalpha. A writer in the London Times, August 13, 1835, is incorrect in stating that these marks are confined to Germany and are to be found only since the 12th or 13th centuries. More recent researchers have shown that they existed in many other countries, especially in Scotland, and that they were practiced by the builders of ancient times. Thus, Ainsworth in his Travels 2:167 tells us in his description of the ruins of Al-Hadi in Mesopotamia that every stone, not only in the chief building but in the walls and bastions and other public monuments when not defaced by time, is marked with a character which is for the most part either a Chaldean letter or numeral. Monsieur Didron, who reported a series of observations on the subject of these masons' marks to the Comité historique des arts et monuments of Paris, believes that he can discover in them references to distinct schools or lodges of Freemasons. He divides them into two classes, those of the overseers and those of the men who work the stones. The marks of the first class consist of monogrammatic characters, those of the second are of the nature of symbols such as shoes, trowels, mallets, etc. A correspondent of the Freemasons' Quarterly Review states that similar marks are to be found on the stones which compose the walls of the fortress of Allahabad, which was erected in 1542 in the East Indies. He says, "The walls are composed of large oblong blocks of red granite and are almost everywhere covered by Masonic emblems which evince something more than mere ornament. They are not confined to one particular spot, but are scattered over the walls of the fortress, in many places as high as 30 or 40 feet from the ground. It is quite certain that thousands of stones on the walls bearing these Masonic symbols were carved, marked, and numbered in the quarry previous to the erection of the building. In the ancient buildings of England and France, these marks are to be found in great abundance." In a communication on this subject to the London Society of Antiquaries, Professor George Godwin states that, in my opinion, these marks, if collected and compared, might assist in connecting the various bands of operatives, who, under the protection of the Church, mystically united, spread themselves over Europe during the Middle Ages and are known as Freemasons. Professor Godwin describes these marks as varying in length from 2 to 7 inches and as formed by a single line, slightly indented, consisting chiefly of crosses, well-known Masonic symbols, emblems of the Trinity and of Eternity, the double triangle, trowel, square, etc. The same writer observes that in a conversation in September 1844 with a mason at work on the Canterbury Cathedral, he found that many masons, all who were Freemasons, had their mystic marks handed down from generation to generation. This man had his mark from his father, and he received it from his grandfather. They're traced in lines on the Parthenon, inscribed by the subtle Greek and Roman legions have carved them on walls, roads, and arch antique long ere the Goth. With Vandal hand gave scope to his envy dark, the mason craft in many a land has graven its mason mark. The obelisk old and the pyramids around which a mystery clings, the hieroglyphs on the coffin lids of weird Egyptian kings. Syria, Carthage and Pompeii, buried and strewn and stark, have marble records that will not die, their primitive mason mark upon column and frieze and capital in the eye of the chaste volute, on Scotia's curve or an astragale, or in Triglip's channel acute, cut somewhere on the entablature, and oft, like a sudden spark, flashing a light on a date obscure, shines many a mason mark. These craftsmen old had a genial whim that nothing could e'er destroy, with a love of their art that naught could dim. They toiled with a chronic joy, nothing was too complex to essay, in aught they dashed to embark. They triumphed on many an Appian way where they'd left their mason mark, crossing the Alps like Hannibal, or skirting the Pyrenees on peak and plain, in crypt and cell, on foot or on bandaged knees. From Tiber to Danube, from Rhine to Seine, they needed no letters of marque. Their art was their passport in France and Spain, and in Britain their mason mark. The monolith grey and druid chair, the pillars and towers of Gael, in ogam occult their age they bear, that time can only reveal. Live on, old monuments of the past, our beacons through ages dark. In primal majesty still you'll last, endeared by each mason mark. Anonymous. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.